Throughout the second decade of the 19th century, America is growing rapidly, and Marshall, like his heroes George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, believes only a strong federal government and a strong national economy can hold the new nation together. This is a printing press of Marshall's youth, but throughout his life, print was like today's social media. Marshall and his critics were just as mean, maybe because they were all neighbors living together in Richmond. They used pseudonyms, but everyone knew who wrote what. 4 weeks after the Dartmouth decision, Marshall's court heard a case that pitted the powers of the federal government versus those of the states. His decision in McCulloch versus Maryland was attacked by critics in Jefferson's Republican Party, egged on by the ex-president himself. For the only time in his life, Marshall took to the press to defend himself.
The issue is, who makes money?
Do you have a national economy? Do you have a national bank? Do you have a national currency?
The issue was whether Congress could charter a Bank of the United States. I mean, you might say, well, how could it be an issue? Because Congress had already chartered the Bank of the United States. In 1791, had run for 20 years.
The Bank of the United States was controversial from the very beginning. In the 1790s, when it first comes up, Hamilton raises it, and when it first comes up, Jefferson is quite opposed to it.
The Bank of the United States prompted the first major debate in America about the scope of Congress's power to regulate the national economy.
This is the headquarters of the Federal Reserve, the successor of the Bank of the United States. Randall Quarles is vice chairman of the Federal Reserve System. Mr. Quarles.
Welcome. How do you do?
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Oh, thanks for being here.
Why does a country need a central bank? I mean, for centuries.
It provides a stable currency for a country. It regulates the banking system and the financial system of a country.
Imitating their financial system. What was Alexander Hamilton trying to accomplish when he proposed the first Bank of the United States?
At the time that the first Bank of the United States was proposed, the financial system of the U.S. was, absolutely an embryo.
There was no coordination between Congress and the individual states, with local banks and businesses issuing their own banknotes.
They had neither the scale nor the trust to really provide the type of financial support for what would be a rapidly growing economy. And then you had, continuing through that time, the political and economic concerns about concentration of power and the continuing questions about constitutional legitimacy that ultimately led to the demise of the first bank. No sooner had the first bank ended than we had the War of 1812. And the financial and economic upheavals of that war reinforced in the minds really of everyone the usefulness of a central bank.
The debt we ran up in the War of 1812 caused even many Jeffersonians to change their minds and say, well, we really do need this bank as a matter of public policy. So we'll avert our gaze or we'll hold our noses and we will permit a second bank to be chartered.
The second bank got off to a pretty bad start.
Staffed by speculators and people who are interested in a quick buck, in the rising value of war debt left from the War of 1812.
In some cases, they engaged in practices that I think were pretty clearly fraudulent. That particularly happened in Baltimore.
By 1819, Baltimore was the largest city in the American South and a powerhouse of trade and industry.
Maryland has passed a law imposing a tax on out-of-state banks, banks that haven't been chartered by the state of Maryland. And oh, what a coincidence, there's only one bank that this applies to, and it's the Bank of the United States.
James McCulloch is the cashier of the Bank of the United States, and it is up to him to pay these taxes. He does not pay the taxes, and the state of Maryland sues him to get the taxes.
The state of Maryland and the second bank agree to a suit that will test the state law's constitutionality. The governor calls the case an amicable arrangement, and when the state court decides against the bank, McCulloch appeals to the U.S. Supreme Court.
This comes before the court, and there are two main questions in the case. The first question is whether the federal government has the power to create a bank at all.
And then the second question is, well, if it's permissible for the bank to exist at all as a federally chartered bank, can Maryland tax the bank?
And the court answers both questions in favor of the national government.
Because it's a properly federally chartered bank, and states can't undo what the federal government has properly done. That's actually not the most interesting part of McCulloch versus Maryland. The most interesting part of McCulloch versus Maryland is why the bank wins, how Marshall chooses to explain his result.
Marshall answered the first question, yes. Congress had the power to charter a bank, even though that is not listed among Congress's enumerated powers.
And therein lies the problem, right? The federal government is supposed to have enumerated powers only, those powers that are listed in the Constitution.
But there's nothing in the Constitution that says you can do a bank.
The phrase, "we must never forget it is a Constitution we are expounding," comes in the case of McCulloch versus Maryland.
What does that mean? It seems to suggest that a constitution is not a statute, a lawyer's document, a technical series of rules that have to be applied in the strictest and least forgiving way.
Marshall and his 6 fellow justices have now been together for 7 years, and the Chief Justice is at the height of his power and influence.
Marshall decides that although the power isn't expressly granted to the United States to charter a bank or other corporation, it is implied by the Constitution.
Marshall relied on a clause from Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Congress may make all laws which shall be necessary and proper to executing its enumerated powers. Or as Marshall put it, let the end be within the scope of the Constitution, all means adapted to it and not prohibited are constitutional. Did Marshall think he was interpreting a living constitution?
It's a clever metaphor. It's an attractive metaphor. Who wants a dead constitution?
If you mean a document that was malleable and could be shaped to the particular purposes of the people interpreting it, the answer is definitely no. On the other hand, if you're talking about a document that would remain relevant despite changes in society, well, very much.
I think he thought that the Constitution doesn't decide every question, that it leaves a lot of questions to be decided by Congress and by the president. It leaves a lot of things to the states, and it necessarily speaks in general terms, and those terms have to be applied to new situations that often could not have been anticipated at the time that it was adopted.
John Marshall decides not only that the bank is constitutionally permissible, but that the efforts of Maryland to tax the bank are constitutionally impermissible.
The power to tax involves the power to destroy, and the power to destroy may defeat the power to create. The states have no power, by taxation or otherwise, to retard, impede, burden, or in any manner control the operations of constitutional laws enacted by Congress. The judgment of the Court of Appeals of the state of Maryland is therefore erroneous and must be reversed.
The states' rights people hate McCulloch because of its implications.
And it's all the more brilliant because he's getting justices who have been appointed by Jefferson and by Madison to join this opinion. He gets a unanimous court.
Temperatures ran high. Jefferson called Marshall and his colleagues secure for life and skulking their responsibilities. Marshall called Jefferson the most ambitious and unforgiving of men. Their struggle would go on, but Marshall had established the Constitution as the people's act and therefore supreme. In In a vault at the New York Historical Society, James Basker, president of the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History, shows me how painful the fallout from the McCulloch decision is for John Marshall.
A letter actually in John Marshall's hand.
There he is, Richmond. Okay, from his main residence, 1823. So this is 4 years after the McCulloch decision, but the issues that it raised and the passions that it raised are still political matters. And he's writing to his correspondent about Mr. Johnson, who is Senator Richard Johnson of Kentucky, who is a critic of the court. And he's proposing a number of constitutional amendments to clip its wings.
You can feel the urgency of this crisis, of this issue, in Marshall's handwriting. He's not.
In the letter, Marshall opposes Senator Johnson's constitutional amendments on the grounds that they would weaken the very authority Marshall himself had worked so hard to establish for the court. His recipient here is Henry Clay, who's another senator, a sympathetic senator.
Yes.
So he's writing an ally in the Senate about an enemy in the Senate.
How often did Marshall intervene or try to connect with the political sphere as he was preserving the court's autonomy?
Very carefully and very strategically.